Alright, this video is going to be about repairing wiring harnesses on cars. And if you work in a collision shop, you're always working on wiring harnesses, the front of the car, the back of the car. Wiring harnesses get cut from collisions, sockets get broke, tail lamp wiring gets damaged. So I'm going to cover a bunch of different ways to repair the wiring, and I'm going to show you what I usually use, what works best for me. So let's take a look at some of the stuff I got sitting here. Okay, some of the basic tools you're going to need for repairing wiring harnesses is some side cutters, some type of insulation strippers, crimping tools, maybe a little butane torch. And then we also need some way to splice these wires back together, and that could be butt connectors, it could be solder, and there's a few things in my kit here, and I'm going to show you what not to use. And this isn't a sponsored video. I had to buy this butt connector myself. The main thing you have to focus on when you're repairing a wiring harness is keeping that joint watertight. And that's where heat shrink fittings come in, or regular just heat shrink tubing that you put over your connection. You want to make it a nice solid connection, either solder or a crimp fitting. Any moisture getting into repair will actually just ruin the wiring harness. I've run across wiring over the years on vehicles that either was spliced before or water just got into a plug-in or a light socket, and it'll start corroding that copper wire, and you'll have that green oxidation on there, and that stuff will travel all the way through the wiring harnesses, and given enough time it'll probably make it to the other end. I've stripped out some wiring out of harnesses. It was literally corroded probably 2 feet into the wiring harness, so it never stops. That corrosion is always creeping up into the wiring, and it'll make that copper brittle, and it'll break down over time. All right, in this harness here I've got one wire that's cut, and the first thing we need to do is strip the insulation back. And actually I've got all kinds of stuff to do that with. These are probably the most common and the cheapest. You have to make sure you use the correct opening when you're stripping these wires, and it'll tell you the gauge here from 10 all the way up to 22. You want to strip back some insulation for a connection, and I'm going to say this is probably a 20 to 22 gauge wire. You want to put that on there, spin a little bit, and slide it off. When you strip this insulation back, you don't want to damage the copper. If there's any of the copper strands inside this leftover piece of insulation, you cut too deep into it. So make sure it's matched for the correct gauge of wire. This one here is pretty handy, but a lot of places you can't get this in. If you're working on a wiring harness, it's tucked down inside the engine bay. These are a little bit rough to get in sometimes, and you have to be able to see in there pretty good. You put the wiring in the jaws here. It locks down on it and spreads it apart, and those work real good. Those things will self-adjust for no matter what size wire you have in there. Then I've got these things here, and these things are pretty old. I don't even know who they're made by. It says RAR, but I think these are from China or Taiwan. I've had them for years, and they work, but sometimes they can pinch a little bit too tight, and they'll actually pull some of the wiring out. Clamps down on the insulation here, and it's got those jaws. That'll dig into the insulation and start stretching it back. And you have to be careful that you're not pulling any of the copper strands out of there. And it's got a little adjustment on the back here, and that'll set the tension on those jaws. These are probably the most common ones, but I do like these. These are from Mac Tools. The only thing I don't like with these, they have the crimpers down here if you're putting butt connectors on there. For crimping the butt connectors, I like these because you can just get up there and squeeze it and you're done. These are down here into the lower part of the handles, and if you don't have access right to the end of the wiring harness, you have to go over it and then get in here to do it, and a lot of times it's a little bit tight to see. Now a lot of guys would just grab these butt connectors here and you just put them on the wire and crimp it down. There's no protection here. Moisture gets in there, it'll start corroding, and it'll deteriorate this wiring over time, and it'll cause you all kinds of electrical problems. I've seen wiring jobs where someone just used these connectors and put electrical tape around it. Electrical tape isn't watertight. It's an insulation. It'll protect from abrasion. So these type I don't use, but I'm gonna do a little demonstration. I'm gonna see if there's a way we can use these. You know, another common way is just soldering wires together, and I don't like stripping the wires back and just twisting them and soldering them. If you're working in a collision shop, you just want to get these wiring harnesses patched up as quick as possible and make sure they're sealed up. And so most of the time I use a butt connector with the heat shrink on it, because these have a sealant in there. Once you heat these up with a little butane torch, the rubber on here will shrink up. It makes a nice watertight seal, so I'm going to demonstrate those. And another type of connection that I never use is these Scotch locks. And these here, you don't even need to strip the insulation. You slide your wires in here, and it has this little metal piece in there, and what it does, you squeeze this with a pair of pliers. It actually cuts into the insulation, and it makes a contact between the two wires, and then it's got a cap over there. These things aren't watertight. I've seen these things used, and they corrode the wires pretty good. Okay, let's do a quick splice on this wire here that's broke. And I'm gonna strip both ends back about maybe 3/8 of an inch. And I wanna twist the strands together. I'm gonna use a butt connector with the heat shrink. Make sure all the wires are in there. Sometimes they'll get bunched up and they won't go into that sleeve in there, so double check those. Now I just got a piece of this tin I bent up. This is just a piece of furnace tin. And I want to protect the rest of the harness from the torch. Heat this up even. Don't get carried away and scorch it. You can see how that stuff shrinks around the wiring, and we should be able to see sealant coming out of there. It'll dry up. It's kind of sticky when it's warm, but that's watertight now. It's crimped, so it's a good connection, and we shouldn't be able to pull that apart. Now it's nice and tight, that's secure. That should hold up for the life of the vehicle. Here's another type of heat shrink with some solder made into it. These things actually work pretty good, but they're a little bit harder to use because you have to overlap the wires. And if you just got a clean cut in here, you might not have any room to pull those wires together, but they have to overlap inside this, and you'll heat it up. That's actually a little bit of low temperature solder in there, and the wires go right through it. Once you heat this up, it's a heat shrink tubing, and that solder will melt, trying to have enough slack in there to pull the two wires together. And being you're not crimping it, it's hard holding those two in place where you want it. I quit using these quite a while ago just because they're a little bit rougher to use. I'm going to set something up so we can use this, see how it works. So let's heat this up with the heat gun. So that solder melted pretty quick. You really can't see much in there. It's in there, and you hope there's enough to solder that together. But yeah, I haven't used these in years, but it's an option. I can't pull it apart, so it must work okay. Let's try one of these with the heat gun now. Yeah, that works pretty good. It heats it up, it shrinks it. You can see the sealant oozing out of there. Okay, here's another way I like to splice them, and I usually use these if I'm at home working on my own stuff, either trailer wiring or something like that. That's buying these little butt connectors with no insulation on them, and I'm going to show you what I do here. These I'm going to crimp them, I'm going to solder them, and it's going to have heat shrink on it, but I also coat the thing with dielectric grease. This heat shrink doesn't have any sealant in it, and I don't trust that it seals it up 100% in case it doesn't shrink enough. But if you coat it with this dielectric grease, this will prevent corrosion. Got my wires stripped back here. First thing I'm going to do is put my heat shrink on here. And I'm going to crimp this. I'm going to solder this in with the butane torch and some electrical solder. I'm going to coat this splice with dielectric grease. I'm going to smear a bunch on here. I usually put quite a bit on here. I want everything coated. Slide the heat shrink on there, and any excess, I'll just force it into the ends here. I'm going to heat that up with the butane torch. Now I like splicing wires this way. It's crimped so you've got the strength there, and then by putting the solder there, that gives a good contact in there. Everything is nice and tight and secure with the grease inside that heat shrink. That's a watertight joint right there. Okay, here's something else I always keep around. This liquid tape. It's actually liquid electrical tape, and if you've got a wiring harness that's got a little bit of damage where just the insulation is peeled back and it didn't damage the wire inside, instead of cutting this apart and putting a splice in there, you can just brush it on here, and it'll dry up in a couple minutes. And I'll put usually 2-3 coats on there, make sure it's coated good. That serves the same purpose as the insulation. That'll dry up, protect the wires. I'll come back, put another coat on there. Whoop, too much. Okay, here's a situation that you're probably going to run into if you're working in a collision shop. You're going to have a whole bunch of wires cut all in one place. So if you just want to put butt connectors in here, you're going to have them all bunched up, and we've got 3 wires cut there. This one's already been repaired. You're going to have 3 butt connectors all in this tight area, and this harness has to go back inside this little case here. You have to spread these repair sections out. I'm going to cut these pieces out and stagger my joints and splice in new wires. So for this, I'm just using these cheap butt connectors here because, well, they're cheap and it's just for demonstration. Whenever you're repairing your wiring harness and you've got to use a different piece of wire, make sure you size it to the same size or a little bit thicker. Now, I'm not an electrical engineer, and I know you don't want to go smaller, and somebody may tell me that, well, you can't go bigger because that's a problem. I've always done it that way, and over the years, I've probably put on hundreds of new pigtails on wiring harnesses, either a light socket or something. You order them right from the manufacturer when you're ordering your parts, and they always come with heavier wire than what's on the car. Okay, now we're all done. These should fit into that harness okay, but if we had all these together, it would be way too thick. So these lay out nice. So, you know, if you had a harness like this with about 6-7 wires cut in there and you tried doing all butt connectors together, probably wouldn't even get this plastic sheathing over it. It's just going to be like a big football in there. Spread those out like that and that'll work out good. Okay, I'm going to try something here with one of these butt connectors and see if I could make it watertight. Put some of this dielectric grease in both ends. And I've got a piece of heat shrink that'll just fit over this. Well, I should have had it centered a little bit better. So yeah, that actually shrunk up okay. It squeezed that grease out of there. It looks like it's sealed up okay. Okay, that's the way I do it. Whatever makes your repair nice and secure, good contact running through the wire, and no corrosion issues down the road. I hope this video was helpful. Thanks for watching.